welcome to Further Comments. Really thrilled to have you and really thrilled to be seeing Horace Wu today. How are you, Horace?
Damien, Riehl, I'm doing very well. Welcome back from Estonia.
Thanks. I just arrived last night and I'm jet lagging a bit, but it's always fun to see our Nordic and Baltic friends. They're doing really cool things, at least some of them, as they're really focused on design, and that's something that Margaret Hagen from Stanford has really been focused on design. So there were a lot of good design sessions, and the Estonians were very, very welcoming and good. So yeah, it was fun to be able to get out of our legal tech bubble, to be able to expand my horizons. How have you been?
I've been well, and I'm a little bit jealous because I hear they serve wonderful meatballs with these design sessions.
There were really excellent chicken meatballs, but I did not have any reindeer meatballs, sadly. Next time, perhaps. But Horace, we have somebody really exciting and brilliant with us. Can you say who that is?
Everyone, so in case you are not watching the video, we have Dr. Megan Ma with us. Megan, welcome.
Thank you, Damien and Horace, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. It honestly feels like I'm having a chat with you all in like a fictional living room, so to speak. So this is great.
If you don't know Megan, you should. Stanford, really one of the smartest minds and really doing amazing things to be able to think about how the practice of law should be done. And so we'll be talking about that a lot today.
Before we begin, every time I go to a conference, Megan, if you are presenting in the session, I try to move everything around so that I can attend your session. But that said, I haven't been to a conference in quite a number of years, well, except for ILTACon, because I've got kids. I hear you may or may not be on a similar path.
Yeah, so I guess a little bit of personal news is that I'll be expecting my first in August. And so I go and tell everyone that, as I'm working and playing around with artificial intelligence, I'm incubating human intelligence or natural intelligence.
Does the scientist in you want to be like, now that I've experimented with AI, I'm going to do the exact same things to my little baby?
Well, I mean, there was this, I think, article from the New Yorker a while back about watching your toddler be a small language model that is infinitely more efficient than, what's available out there. I think the scientist in me will probably do the same in terms of observation, but I don't think I will actively intervene in any way.
There's also Jan LeCun of Meta and others that talk a lot about how we as humans, as we grow up in the first 1, 2, 3 years of our life, we don't really have a world model yet. So we're really creating a world model as to, gravity and cause and effect and that sort of thing. And there's a really good analogy as to large language models is that they have, some kind of linguistic models, but they don't yet have world models as what's happening in the world. So Megan, you're in the next few years going to be really seeing humans go through the same things that we're trying to do with machines, aren't we?
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating experience, I think. And I'm going to have a new title of being a first-time mom. So yeah, any tips out there? I welcome anything and all.
I remember with our first baby, there was this one day about 4 or 5 months in when she was playing with her hands and playing with objects, and then she suddenly paused and looked at her hands. And for the first time, she realized, these are my hands. And I look forward to your experiencing lots and lots of those moments very soon, Megan.
So those are great. Yeah, the self-realization. And some advice I was given when we had our first child that was good advice is that between now and August, you should go to as many restaurants as you can. Because for the next few years, maybe restaurant going is going to be a luxury that you won't be able to have, that between now and August you will.
That's great advice. As someone that's kind of a foodie, I think I will definitely take you on that. Also, one thing that sort of this self-realization is really fascinating to me because right now I almost see that language models have this hardware software divide still, and we have very little discussion about embodied AI, or there was a surge from NVIDIA for a bit. Kind of seeing how it manifests in humans. For example, I mean, Fei Li, she started World Labs because she wants to bridge the two. So, seeing how it continues to play out for humans versus how we're struggling with that at so many different levels from a physical sense still is going to be so intriguing.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. So embodiment is one thing. And the other thing is, as your child grows up, you're probably going to be thinking, as I have with my 2 children, is what is the world that they'll be going into? What is the workforce that they'll be going into? How can they meaningfully contribute to a world that large language models will be native to them for their entire working career? Your child will be even more so than my 19 and 12-year-old. What is left for humanity to do? I think there's a lot, but you and I and everyone on this call will be thinking a lot about that.
One thing my parents have been kind of nagging me on almost is that they said, well, you go and talk about AI a lot, and in the womb, your child, all they can listen to is this. They're probably going to come out like literally already knowing everything there is to know about ChatGPT. I was like, they might know a lot of information that is not relevant for them anymore.
It's almost literally information by osmosis.
I love it. I love it. But Megan, you've been doing a lot of research recently as well, especially about simulations and multi-agent simulations. So, we all know agent right now is a bit of a buzzword. Some real stuff, lots of just hype. But your stuff is absolutely real. So tell us a little bit more about the research you've been doing into multi-agent simulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, one thing that has been keeping me up at night a little bit is that we have a lot of tools that are out there. But to be honest, I think the target group or the users that make the most out of it is not necessarily the ones that will kind of be the younger group at this point. I think for them, many of the younger attorneys, they still need time to develop the historical legal skills, how to understand the nuance of the practice. All the while, we're in this phase where there's a mass adoption, at least even at the pilot level, of various types of tools. And many of them are intuitive. Some of the contract drafting tools or any of the legal document generation ones, they are struggling to reveal why you have to phrase certain things or why you would want to phrase certain things or issue spy or any of these other types of skills. And so we started to think, how do you actually leverage large language models to train a young attorney instead? And so we were thinking about it from the perspective of, oh, what are these models actually really good at? And one area is role playing. Both of you have kids, like maybe early on, you said like, oh, can you explain this to me like a pirate? And it does that pretty well. And so we kind of took that and ran with it. We started to build a negotiation simulator about a year and a half ago. And the first question was, can it negotiate with a senior attorney at a level of sophistication? And really, what we were trying to figure out was some of that more implicit experiential knowledge. We were trying to tap into the brains of senior partners. And we noticed it wasn't actually performing super well. We kind of found that it was taking things that were from the documents or the final signed agreement, but not really catching those linguistic nuances maybe during the deal. How do you assess or determine very, very early before you even go into due diligence, like before signing a letter of intent, like how do you even evaluate whether or not this is a deal worth pursuing? And so we built all the relevant stakeholders as agents in the simulation. And so for us, we know that agents typically are framed at this point as task distribution. For us, we are kind of thinking of them as personas of again, relevant stakeholders that are involved in a particular deal. And so we created a client agent, we created specialty counsel that you might have to bring in, and we obviously have the opposing counsel. And we tried to create a scenario that was broad and brief. And the goal of that was to get a young attorney to tease out from the client what exactly their expectations are for that deal. And so rather than spoon feeding them in any way, we actually want them to start asking good questions. Of course, we have other kind of pedagogical tools such as hints. We throw in sample prompts to kind of get the thing going. But all of that is really putting on a kind of safe space in a way for a young attorney to just experiment and see what are some ways that make sense of going about a complex M&A deal. And we had built this tool with some M&A partners, especially from Flatiron Law, so Lenny and Conrad, who are there. They spent a lot of hours with us. And now we've created a platform that you can customize any agent such that they reflect the personalities up to 85% likeness to a particular person you have in mind. And I can talk a little bit more about how we did that type of training as well. But altogether, we've just actually, as of today, launched a pilot to a big law firm and their summer associates, and we're going to test how it's going to improve their negotiation skills.
That's so amazing. So good. Yeah. So what I love a lot about your agent simulation is that you're really putting into practice something that you and I and Alona from Cleary talked about on stage on Site Practice. We had something on agents. And there are a lot of people that speaking in the abstract about agency, and you're really doing the work. That is the real work to be able to show how students and these bots will interact. So that's thing number one that I really like. Thing number two is that we think about agents as bots doing legal work. But of course, we are also lawyer agents doing client work. That is, we are agents really doing the bidding of our clients. What you're doing is you're taking agent bots and putting them together with agent lawyers, that is students, being able to do this work together. So that's thing number 2 that I really like. Thing number 3 that I really like is that you really are taking things that are in lawyers' brains and putting it into artifacts that can be used by large language models. A lot of things that our lawyers need that is precedent. How did we do this deal before? What are the documents that really paper up this negotiation, right? These artifacts we focus on a lot with knowledge management through the document management system and others. But what we don't really focus as much on is what is not captured in those artifacts, and that's the negotiations. Those closed-door meetings are often the skill and expertise over years and decades really are in lawyers' brains. And so what you're doing is really being able to take that stuff from lawyers' brains and putting it into an artifact. And so what I've been thinking a lot about over the last few years, and something that maybe you might be able to implement in future, is to be able to say, maybe you can capture what's in lawyers' brains through audio and video. That is to be able to take the implicit knowledge in brains and make it explicit into an artifact. So capture video and audio, and then that will turn it into signal that can be used by the large language models. We have the textual signal, audio to text, right? But you also have non-textual signal. That is in the audio, there could be a pregnant pause. That is good signal. That is, somebody is thinking really hard before they come back with their next one. That's a good signal to say either you've prompted some thought or this is something that they're angry about, right? But the pregnant pause in the audio side, and then the visual side, you have maybe an eyebrow being raised. And, we don't yet have really good models to be able to have that as a signal, but you can imagine quite soon we could be able to say this frown, this slight frown, or an eyebrow being raised, or, eyes wide open. These are good signals for negotiations. So anyway, so those are the 3 things that I really love, that as we get our GPUs and GPUs cheaper, faster, better, stronger, we could be able to maybe do more of these work.
Yeah, I love those points that you touched, Damien, because in terms of the audio video side, so how we trained those agents was 2 hours to 5 hours of audio interview. And that was enough to capture 85% likeness to a particular person. And it's exactly because of this nuance in the way that we communicate information in a free flowing conversation. And so, how we structured these interviews is we have it in 2 parts. One is focused on war stories or watershed moments of that particular attorney, or even for the client, like, what makes them unique in that particular way. And the second was what we call the toolkit interview. This is where attorneys talk about if they are saying something to the effect of, it takes me only 2 minutes to review this legal brief, and I can know exactly where the issues are or where the flow of the argument is. Those 2 minutes didn't come about overnight. It came from years and years of going through very similar structures. And so we ask questions that tease out what are those triggers for you as a senior attorney that get you to hit those points very quickly. And so a combination of those actually builds a lot of our personas. And what's interesting is that our approach, we will have a paper that we submitted and it's undergoing peer review right now, but what it proved was actually a 22% increase in the performance of the model, actually, just by training it on particular senior personas. And so we're trying to figure out where exactly can you integrate this experiential knowledge or having a persona into the actual human-machine collaboration of some of these tools. The thing that is really exciting that you also point to, Damien, was adding almost the audio and video features as you're doing the training. So with the audio, we started to integrate that already. So there is a mode that you can turn on and you can kind of like use that negotiation. With the video, we experimented a while back. And to be honest, the feedback we got was, this is uncanny valley. It's too eerie for me. But honestly, since Google came out with VO3, I'm not surprised that we could bring that back just because now it seems much more realistic and it's much more like a Google Meet as opposed to like something that was kind of almost creepy. So I think we're really excited about just the future direction. And one of the, just as a small kind of brag on my team, one of my researchers, she was involved in building Vision Pro with Apple. And she's now obviously on my team right now. And so she's very, very keen to do things in AR and VR. And so maybe we'll see that as well in the simulation.
That's really cool. In creating the personas, you did a lot of interviews and recorded those. Did you also simulate a senior lawyer doing the negotiation themselves? That is, how did the senior lawyer push on this point or maybe fall back on that point? Did you do that work as well?
We did. So we actually had some partners got really excited to play around with the tool. And so what they did was because it's customizable on the back end, they inputted just high level facts of ongoing deals that they were doing. And then they were playing on their partner level. So we actually have multiple levels. We have everything from summer associate now all the way to partner. And when they were playing on the partner mode, they also inputted the specific personalities of their client and the opposing counsel, et cetera, the whole suite. And what they discovered was that they were able to play out six, seven different strategies on how to negotiate and walk through that deal. And then they just created like a hybrid strategy in the end for their real deal that they were doing. And so they found it as more of a strategy building tool to workshop what makes sense. Maybe they liked this line of questioning, but didn't like the way that it panned out for the rest of the negotiation. So they took on a different line of questioning for maybe part two of certain questions, or if they're focused on, say, structure of the deal, maybe they want to use certain types of phrasing as opposed to others when they talk about reps and warranties, something like that. And so it's a whole spectrum of going from training all the way to strategy. Obviously, the younger attorneys can use it for training, but it doesn't hold them back from down the line using it for their own strategy building as well.
That's great. It's like a shadow boxing. Let's run this scenario and run that scenario. And I could imagine that as GPUs get cheaper, you could be able to brute force. That is, run Monte Carlo simulations as to be able to say, well, let's do 1,000 of these techniques and see which ones get the deal done and which ones don't. This is really cutting edge, really exciting things.
Yeah, I mean, we have been speaking with some folks that have done simulation testing, so done it on the other side, just to test out where can you find alignment between perceived risks and actual risks of a particular tool. And they had been kind of running things very similar to the Monte Carlo simulations. Definitely doesn't preclude us from doing that. And so then we add a different dimension of creating almost like predictive analytics to a type of multi-agent simulation.
That's great. And the perceived risk versus actual risk, it reminds me of a story that an in-house counsel said that another in-house counsel had advised a business person saying, we cannot do that because there's too much risk. And then the business person asked, well, Kate, how many times has this scenario happened? And they said about 1,500. And then they said, how many times has it gotten us into trouble? They said once. So they said one in 1,500. I will take that risk. So there's the legal risk that lawyers are just risk identification machines, right? We identify risk and then shine a light on it. But of course, there's actual risk and not the perceived risk. I love that you're recognizing both.
There's a team that they're working on this tool right now, and really their backgrounds came from self-driving cars, where simulation testing was a big part of it, because deploying these cars, even with the best live deployment, has pretty severe consequences to it. And so they started to build all these little cities and kind of play out what are the worst case scenarios that some of their policy teams have enumerated. And the conclusion was that, exactly to your point, the actual catastrophic incident happens one in maybe 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times or something like that. And now what their team is doing is, can we do that with large language model apps, or apps that are built on top of generative AI, or agents that are built on top of generative AI? Having this type of tool, I think, are tangible ways in which you can actually look towards what's the future of risk mitigation. And you also bring together actually policy teams and regulatory teams against the technical teams, because the policy teams are better at enumerating and the legal teams as well, right, are enumerating what those risks are, but then we can validate them now.
And really, there's the numerosity of them. Was there a close call where you almost hit the pedestrian, or was it more severe where you actually plow into a whole crowd of onlookers, right? So that severity. And then there's legal risk analog to say, is this something that we got called out by a tiny regulator, or is this something that make the New York Times and the Times of London, right? So there's both the numerosity, how many times that this risk has happened, and then what is the severity of each of those risks. I think, you can run those through Monte Carlo simulations and be able to say, what is the identification of the risk, and then we could actually quantify that risk, much like insurance companies quantify that risk. Because insurance companies say, what is the risk of a hurricane hitting this? And then once the hurricane hits, how severe does that hurricane? And then you could put both the numeric, the odds of this happening, as well as the monetary value. That is, how much property damage can this be? I think we could do that with law. If you have enough data, you could be able to put both the numeric odds risk and then also the severity risk in numeric, quantifiable monetary values. Any thoughts on how we could be able to agentify or at least role play those things?
To me, what it is kind of adding that additional part in the pipeline where right now we're thinking about in our current workflows, how do we reconceptualize this division of labor, right? Historically, we've understood maybe how to do that with humans. We are able to detect relative strengths and weaknesses in a particular team, and that's how you parse work. Now, I think we have to be a little bit more careful on how to do that from a technical standpoint. We have agents that some of them maybe are going to be our PhD level agents that sort of do highly specialized work. But then you need agent orchestration, the person that is going to govern or manage over those agents. And then are humans going to be playing the role of the managers of these managing agents, something like that. And I mean, what's fascinating is that for our multi-agent simulation, we noticed actually that some of the off-the-shelf models, such as LangChain or Llama Index, that have been great at multi-agent orchestration for task-based uses just don't work at all for communication, for example. And so our negotiation simulation is entirely tethered to communication and how we interact with one another. We actually had to create a whole new custom framework from the ground up in order to capture actually how we interact with one another, how we remember certain things, and then how we relay information going forward. That's why this whole area of like division of machine labor is still in an incredibly blurry area. And like on top of that, going back to that phase of evaluation that I think we're in, we still haven't quite pinpointed all the various criteria needed in order to best optimize for these models and where to actually integrate them into our workflow. We have great public benchmarks out there, spearheaded by folks like Val's AI that do that as part of their startup, as well as internally, at Stanford. Damien, you were supportive in one of our benchmarks that we had done. But I think until we have a clear idea of that, that's still a little bit of a mixed bag. And then the other thing is that the actual communication that happens between humans and machines is still incredibly blurry as well. One thing I often point to is when we use deep research or tools like deep research, we're really excited about the first iteration of the product, right? We're like, it's done such a great job for us. It's going to make everything highly efficient. But then when you notice, oh, I just want to make a small point-wise edit, it fails kind of miserably at times. And then it just does not get you to where you want it to go. And like this is some of the conversations that Damien you had with that neurosymbolic AI that you're working on. And so for us, we started to realize that it's not only the agents that are struggling with that, it's the fact that humans struggle with articulating our preferences. And so when you kind of pivot from instructive language or telling someone what to do versus explaining to them what you like and don't like, that's actually a mental shift that we don't talk about a lot. And until we're better at articulating some of these other nuances, how do you actually express your preferences in a highly granular way? We're also going to struggle with this human machine collaboration. And so, something else that we're working on is can we create agents that are built specifically to prompt us and get us to say exactly what our thoughts are for a particular line of task distribution. Going back to your question, when it comes to risk mitigation and kind of thinking about the long tail of risks almost, we have to work through all of these other things that I think everyone's trucking along now. And then we just add that to the very end of the pipeline just to verify all of these things can be grounded in that perceived versus actual risk truth.
That's so fantastic. And I love that you're really thinking through. We have done legal quantification throughout our careers, and we call that anecdata. That is gut instinct. And you don't really put into really numerical terms, what are the odds of this happening? Well, pretty good or not bad. That is anecdata, right? But what you're doing is really putting real data to this. That is true numeric quantification, where you're being able to say, we ran the human senior lawyer through this scenario a bunch of times, and this negotiation tactic worked maybe X% of the time. And you can imagine with litigation saying, this jury argument worked Y% of the time. Or for both, you could say this phrasing works Z% of the time. So going from anecdata, that is just something that lawyers are not able to quantify what is pretty good odds or not bad odds, and to be able to say actually numeric. I wonder if, is this something that we're going to see soon, or are we on our way?
I hope so. Of course, like the limitations that we have is kind of every academic's limitation, which is we don't have necessarily the resources at this moment to have enough GPUs to run some of the things that we are hopeful for. But, the exciting part about what Stanford is doing is that we are massively ramping up and trying to get more GPUs so that we can do this type of experimentation. The other point here is that we are very open to many more collaborations with industries, whether it be law firms as well as legal AI vendors that have been thinking about these questions as well. But to be honest, you have the pressures of external stakeholders that we don't necessarily have. And so I always say I love these types of hand-in-hand collaborations because you can give sort of the hard problems to us, which is the bread and butter for most academics. And then we can kind of play that out to see what's still missing and where we can actually kind of focus some of our resources, even if they're currently limited.
That's fantastic. If you're looking for GPUs, my cousin Katrina Riehl, she's a faculty on Georgetown. She's also currently working for NVIDIA. So a lot of her work for NVIDIA is to be able to find good causes, to be able to have GPUs and be able to figure out how to make the best of NVIDIA's resources. So to the extent you'd like, I'm happy to introduce you to Katrina.
We would love that.
Oh, for sure. That's great. It's all about relationships. Horace, I've been dominating the conversation. What can you add?
Oh, look, I love to hear the two of you kind of bounce ideas around. And Damien, you kind of took it in a very different direction to where I was going to take it. And that was taking us all the way back to the beginning. Megan, you said that you found there was an 85% approximation to the real human. First of all, what does that mean? And then I want to kind of pry that open from there, because I think I'm looking at what happens to that when you compound that over time and compound it over interaction. So go back to the 85% for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a paper that came out in March of 2023. It's the paper that honestly I cannot stop talking about anytime anyone asks me about it, but it's called Generative Agents. And it was written by a number of Stanford researchers here. And basically all they had done was they put a number of large language models at the time together, and they created a fictional city, kind of looks like Minecraft, and they essentially wanted to test out, do these models, when you put them together, do they display sociological behaviors that are kind of like humans? And the answer was yes. And from there, they actually started to simulate, or had an interest to simulate 1,000 people. And they wanted to kind of simulate across the US demographic. And so this paper that came out just about a year later in 2024 focused on how exactly they simulated various people, given like a cross section of the US demographic. And what they had done and their process was they took a 2-hour audio interview. They chose a particular interview protocol. I think it was the American Voices Project. And basically, from there, they tested off-the-shelf models. How likely is it to behave like a human? And then if you add this, persona component or the interview component, how much more likely can it behave as that particular human? And it went from like a 60% to an 85% was their calculation. And so we took this methodology and we said, can we try to figure out this 85% scoring in context of a specific domain, and that domain being law? And then we wanted to figure out, what does it take to become a senior legal expert? And so we started to experiment with different interview techniques. And ultimately, we landed on the one that I had mentioned, which is a 2-part interview, 1 part on the war stories, the watershed moments that I call the memory interview. And then the second part, which is the toolkit interview, which is how do you build up that muscle memory over the years of making you very, very sharp and quick about understanding certain types of legal facts. When we actually evaluated and tested the utility of personas, we also tested basically how good it was at predicting that particular person's next strategy. And that's kind of where the numbers came in.
That's really clever. And 2 questions from there. First, not a question, but a comment. An artist friend of mine once upon a time said to me, whenever you make a painting, there are actually 3 paintings you've created. There's the one in your head, the one you actually painted, and the one that everyone else sees. And so if it feels like with these creations of the models or agents, you're not necessarily kind of creating what's in the person's head, but you're capturing an approximation of them. And Damien, I know you're going to talk about the duck test, and maybe that's what floats here. So really interesting to kind of see the 85%. I'll dig a little bit deeper after the call. On the second point, which is if every single one of these agents is kind of approximating to 85%, and you have 20 of these senior partner agents in the room, can they learn from each other? And can they know between themselves what is a good argument, what's a bad argument?
That is such a fascinating question. So, one of the motivations between one of our other tools that we were building, so not in negotiation, but we built a tool that is a spin on redlining, as well as another tool that is a take on depositions. And both of these are meant to be tackling different forms of training. So, I'll talk about the redlining one. This one was trying to support a young attorney where, it's 2 or 3 a.m. and all they care about is getting that document over the finish line. And so for them, they're just hitting accept change, accept change, accept change. But they're not actually mentally registering why a particular partner has made those red lines and how they edited on top of yours. And so what we've done is you can upload any red line contract onto this platform and you select the particular partner, and then that AI partner, their explanations overlay those red lines and they provide explanations, or they also give feedback on like, you didn't do this red line particularly well, you could have, phrased it this way, which is why we made this edit, etc. And so there's different views that you can do. So that's one tool. And the other tool for the deposition one is you basically could upload any deposition that either you have done or you wanted to dig deeper to see where the strategies have been done well. You do that, you select a particular partner again, and then they will evaluate how well the strategies were played out. And you can highlight different portions of it, like either this is a strategy that's been done really well, or that this is a strategy that's either missed or you inadvertently created a gap, which is kind of the worst case scenario here. And both of these tools, what we're looking for down the line is we started to put in partners with different specializations. And so for the
Mm.
redlining one, we have transactions partners, but we also have litigation partners. And this is mirroring this equivalent in the analog world where a litigation partner, their doors may be knocked on when a transaction partner is like, is this contract really as ironclad as I expect it to be? Are there flags that you're seeing that I'm not seeing? Or, when you're, say, going through M&A negotiation, you might call upon an employment or labor counsel if you know that there may have been some sort of pending litigation leading to a wrongful termination or something like that. So there's a lot of this cross-pollination that exists organically in the law firm space. We just want to figure out how do the models react to them in the same way. And so down the line, it might exactly be like what you're mentioning, Horace, here is that we have all of these different AI partners interacting with one another. We're trying to figure out what's actually the best UX for that. So regardless of the workflow, if I can call upon Horace and Damien at the same time to give me feedback, what would that look like?
That's so good. And really, you're taking into account the personalities of the people involved because, we as lawyers are counselors. That is, we truly counsel our clients. And what type of personality is our client? Do they like aggressive lawyers or do they like more amicable people that just like getting deals done, right? What is the personality of the counterparty? Are they aggressive or do they want to be able to just get the deal done? And then on the litigation side, what's the personality of the judge? Do they like aggressors or do they like folksy people, right? What's well, for this jury, just Southern jury like lawyer type X and West Coast juries like type Y and East Coast juries like type Z. We are a personality driven profession. So that's thing number one, personalities. I love that you're doing that. Number two is on evaluation. That is for legal outputs. I would say there's no such thing as a platonic ideal of something because a good contract is the one that gets the deal done. That is the deal done for this client in this particular counterparty, in this particular industry, for these particular goods and services, in this particular jurisdiction, right? There is no platonic ideal of the best M&A contract. It takes into account all those things. And then for the litigation side, there's no platonic ideal of the best brief, because the best brief is the one that wins. That is the one that wins for this particular judge and for this particular jury and for this particular client and this particular counterparty with these particular facts, right? As we think about these evaluations, there really has to be a recognition of the personalities of the counterparties and the particular facts in this case, because the best brief is going to take into account both of those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the reason why we started with personas really wanted to tap in, like there's a missing component in the way that we're thinking about models, which like you sort of rightly hit the nail on the head, both Horace and Damien, is that, you know, subjectivity in law is pervasive. In the external world, when you describe subjectivity, people are always like, why? And even when I pitched it to some of our computer scientists that work with us, they were like, well, I don't know if this is going to stand as, like good research. And I was like, it's going to be the only research that is going to have significant value for our community. And so that after we came to an agreement on that, that's really where I think like our work on personas took off. And so I 100% agree. Personality study is a huge component. And certainly, if we want to have meaningful and sustainable adoption, even of these tools into our day-to-day workflows, we need to account for personas.
Qualitative studies versus quantitative studies. Can we quantify the subjectivity of lawyers? Can you be able to quantify that numerically?
So, one thing that we've started to think about is when is the role of subjectivity indispensable? And when is it that there's this gut reaction that we have where there are things that are pretty standardized? And we shouldn't be kidding ourselves that there are certain types of contracts that are basically the same across the board.
NDAs.
Exactly. Being able to at least definitively distinguish the two and the role that they play actually comes out of why we need to use personas in certain cases versus not. And so, one of the studies that we've been trying to figure out is, and actually, Damien, you participated in this, which was if you were to do a blind evaluation between human associate output, off the shelf models, and enterprise tools, and a senior partner was given these three exhibits, then it all made blind, what exactly would they describe as their preferences? And the outcomes of actually the study we're presenting in 2 weeks at ICALE, so the International Conference on AI and Law. And what we discovered actually is that the senior partners, when it came to kind of these tasks like the legal research memo or even the early drafts of the motion to dismiss, they almost uniformly had chosen the machine, whether it be enterprise or off the shelf, over the human. And what was really fascinating is that some of the benchmarks that are out there point towards criteria such as hallucination accuracy, comprehensiveness, and completeness, when actually the partner, from something as simple to them as a research memo, targeted the exact line of argument that was already in the minds of that particular attorney. And for a mid level associate, like 3 to 5 years of experience, that's when they start picking up actually that that is what they have to do from the beginning. And so when we try to put numbers or quantify the qualitative, that's why we start with these types of small empirical pilots, is to tease apart actually from a senior partner's perspective, they actually all converge on the same sets of criteria. That is advocacy, argumentation, and these things were uniformly missed from some of the benchmarks we're seeing now. And so the more kind of pilots that we do in this regard, we can actually put numbers on like where the tasks, where we can clearly divide, okay, these are standard sets of tasks with this type of criteria that we can all converge on. And then there's those more sophisticated or higher level critical thinking tasks where we maybe want to point towards personas and use them as judges of, quality in that particular area of work.
This reminds me a lot of OpenAI talked a lot about GPT 4.5 being a much better writer than the others, but they didn't really have any metrics on this. They just said, the vibes that we get with 4.5 are so much better than the vibes that you get with 4.0, right? So I think this is something that I would guess the whole industry, that is the foundational models, and everyone is going to say, what is good argumentation? Well, it's good vibes in the eyes of the beholder, that is in the eyes of the senior partner or the eyes of the subject matter expert. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that in your study, I'm trying to remember how it was formed. I know that you had the machine and you had the human. Did you also have human plus machine?
We didn't do the human plus machine because we just wanted to understand like where the baseline for the humans are. But our next study does have the human plus machine. And then for this study, actually, we only focused on litigation and we are expanding it to transactions soon. But it's really funny because I find that so much of law, when people talk about vibe coding, I was like, the entirety of law is just vibe lawing in some way.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we are creating things on the fly. We are, as a senior partner, are vibe coding with our associates, and we're kind of throwing ideas out there, and then the associates hopefully give back good output. But how much more quickly can the machines give that good output? What you'd said earlier really resonates with me, that the human associates, until they get to the 5th or 6th level, don't know what they don't know. That is, they can't even issue spot to be able to explore the areas that the machine that knows the entire internet and a huge corpus of legal legislation, regulation, and cases will know what those human associates don't know. So I'd be really interested in your next study if you put that human plus the machine, so the machine can tell the human what they don't know and then flesh out maybe arguments, and then the human could be able to maybe extrapolate upon those now fleshed out arguments. So I would guess that they're going to do better than either the machine or the human separately. What do you think?
I absolutely think that, the combination of two is going to prove that there is significant benefits around human machine collaboration because direction is a huge component to how we learn. Humans have historically asked for templates of things, right? Like even from all the way from learning as a kid all the way to now, we need to learn by example. And that's just naturally just the framework that we go with. And so definitely if there are better and better frameworks that can be generated via machine, then they can pick up on these nuances, I think, much faster. The other thing that was quite interesting about the study was that we felt like the incentive structure for the humans was a little bit off. And so we gave grace to the humans, even though they were voted as least preferred, because humans have the emotional and mental bandwidth of just being an associate in a big law firm. But the other thing is that humans can make an active choice whether or not they want to give 100%, 70%, or even 20% to something. Machines can't do that. They will always give 100% to everything or believe confidently that they've given you even 300% to something. And I think there's something to be said not only about creating studies that maybe have like more even incentive structures, but for machines, are there particular tasks that we want to have that sense of confidence that 100% will be given no matter what? Whereas for humans, sometimes we're like, you know what, they gave 70%, but it's because of this deadline that we just have to push it through. And those are some new areas that we can think about and explore simply because, again, machines can't choose actively to not give their best for anything.
So you just said the machines might confidently believe that they did 300% where the human just did maybe 20%. But maybe accurately, if the machine did give 100%, that would truly be 5x the 20% human, right? So maybe it could be doing 500% of what the human did.
It would be so great just to know exactly if humans were to give 100% or what they perceive to be 100%, how does that reasonably measure up to what a machine describes as their 100%? Because we just don't know that right now. And again, it goes back to this piecemeal attack that we've had on evaluation that we're just starting to get a little bit more maturity on.
At that end, not all humans are created equal. That is, we have Nobel Prize laureates, and then you have somebody who is a freshman in high school, right? What is the typical human? Is it somebody that's in between the Nobel Prize laureate and the freshman in high school? And what is the typical lawyer? Is it someone that is at the top of their game, or is it someone that is a solo small that is in Podunk Nowheresville that doesn't know anything about anything, right? Which is not to really just put disparagement on Podunkville. I love Podunkville, but there is the median lawyer. And so as we think about can machines beat lawyers, we have to say, is it the best lawyer in the world on this area, or is it the median lawyer, the average lawyer? That's something we're going to have to think about as we do these evaluations.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, we love to use the term rainmaker for a number of lawyers, but being able to bring in revenue into a law firm could simply be extreme charisma and not necessarily how good they are at the technical legal side. And so you have some senior partners that are described as the bookworms of the practice, but they may not be the biggest revenue generators. And so, to your point, Damien, there is such a spectrum. And again, maybe goes back to why we need to look into persona research or personality based research.
Another word for rainmaker is salesperson. And whenever I say that, like lawyers bristle. They say, I am not a salesperson, but I am one of the best rainmakers in my firm, right? But you have charisma and your clients trust you. That is sales. And then once the sales finish, you hand it off to the delivery. You have the finders, the salespeople, the minders, and then the grinders. You have the people that are finders, bring in the business, the rainmakers, the minders who are making sure the client relationship goes well during the duration of the matter, and then the grinders that are really just cranking out bookwormy things. And so as we think about large language models, maybe going up the level of taking human tasks, the grinding is going to be a lot of that human task that goes away. Maybe the minding, less so, because I need to be able to have a human give touch points to the humans within the client. And then the finding, how do you even quantify whether a machine could be able to find and do a good salespeople? Do humans want to buy from bots? And I think the answer is no. So as AI takes more tasks, I think the grinding goes away. Some of the minding maybe goes away if we have portals, but then the finding might be all that's left.
And what's fascinating is actually when we were speaking with some of the law firms that are testing out Deal Mentor, which is our negotiation simulation tool, one thing that they had brought up was we feel like they are learning this finding skill or this kind of client relationship and client management skill too late. And it's because they spend all these years grinding, and again, grinding without real understanding of what they're issue spotting. And so, with some of these new simulation platforms or using multi agents, we can possibly kind of actually tap in right from the beginning that finding skill so that maybe we're working towards a greater group of these like rainmakers that are going to be our future legal experts. I think it's quite exciting that we're finally in a time where the legal industry has such different pivots all across the board.
That's
I
fantastic.
love this. This is such a fascinating topic for me because we've been toying with this idea of companions, like AI being companions for humans. And research have gone out and said that's one of the top use cases for ChatGPT because a lot of people don't have anyone to chat to. Training these models to take on personas of specific lawyers and or a specific skill set, I think is incredible. But one thing plagues on my mind, and that is we say spent 5 hours of training material reshaping one of these language models to behave like a certain person. So there's a persona. And the way I kind of think about it is the language model's neural network is like a giant pitch and code machine. You drop a word in from the top, it goes boop, 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 and it bounces out the next word at the bottom, right? And so all that 5 hours of training is you're reshaping where that pitch and code ball is likely going to bounce out for those responses. How does that tie into actual real world knowledge? Because the knowledge of the 20-year tax partner is different from the knowledge of the 20-year litigator. Where are you pulling that from? How would they know what they don't know or what they do know?
So when just to clarify, when you say they, you mean the agents, or do you mean kind of
The agents,
yeah.
the agents.
So
Yes.
what we noticed is that lawyers communicate wisdom or share knowledge via anecdote, which is why our interviews are so deeply anchored into specific experience that they've had or like stories that they will bring up time and time again. And part of the reason is because these stories have affected their judgment one way or another. And so we think that why there was this almost success in the way that we were able to capture the persona and alter actually how the models come up with certain outputs is because we've trained the model exactly the way that they impart wisdom with their own other humans. And so the way that they've teach other young associates historically, and why so many associates that say if they're mentored by X person, they inadvertently adopt the style or something from that particular partner, we've kind of found a way that it's doing the same thing to a model. And so exactly kind of how the pinball sort of falls, no one really knows. Again, kind of there's lots of like questions around explainability research, but we did notice that anecdotal teaching works for both humans and for machines. And so the more personas we create, the more that it could kind of adopt different styles, whether it's substantively or just purely like grammar reasons, things like that. What's going to be interesting is the cross cutting of different personalities. And what I mean by that is what happens if the model, if you put in two different personas and train one model on two separate lawyers? When does it know to pull one lawyer's wisdom from another? That's the thing that's going to be kind of fascinating. We haven't yet been able to test it. We usually just do one agent and one persona. But down the line, it might be that you can create one persona that embodies three different senior lawyers and see how it reacts to one another.
I love it. Stories are almost Darwinian. Since prehistoric times, the cavemen around the fire said, this is how I brought down the mastodon, or here's how I avoided the saber-toothed tiger, right? And lawyers say, here's how this deal went south. Let me tell you why that's a bad idea. This is why this deal went south. This is how the judge went off on the opposing counsel. So stories are really good and powerful and anecdata. Right? Number two, where Horace was saying that one of the most prevalent uses of GPT is almost therapy and companionship. We as lawyers are also counselors. So this will be really fascinating going forward, how we're going to be able to use large language models as counselors in the truest sense.
One of the projects that we're working on is with the legal clinic here at the law school. And we've been working with their immigration clinic in particular. One of the things that we help them build is actually an intake specialist agent, which is mirrored after some of their intake attorneys. But one thing that they noticed was a problem with mental bandwidth. Some of these stories are incredibly heavy and emotionally dense. And so they could only do them maybe half hour, an hour at a time. We've now been able to kind of create an unlimited sharing space. And apparently, some of these clients that they have actually don't mind that they're talking to an AI because they felt that they could just continue on some of these tangents that they happen to do in any of these types of sort of traumatic situations that they go through. And for a lawyer, they always have to steer the conversation as quickly as they can back to the information that they need. This intake agent, they can listen for as long as they want and then find ways to gently steer the client back to answering those questions. And so we're definitely starting to explore how that has an impact.
And they could do that whenever the client wants, at 3 a.m. when they get off their shift, right? So they're
Right.
infinitely patient and infinitely available.
I'm going to say, Megan, we can talk to you forever about this, and we don't see each other often enough. Damien, I'm sure, like me, your brain's now flooded with ideas and information.
Absolutely.
And I'm not going to ask the usual, what are you optimistic about question, because right now I'm very optimistic about agents.
I'm also very optimistic that people like Megan Ma are doing such amazing things at Stanford and others to be able to really think through where not just the industry is, but where we're going. So Megan, thank you so much for being such a great guest and imparting a lot of wisdom on both us and our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always such a blast talking with the both of you and honestly giving me a space to just share all my mad sciencey thoughts about this entire space.
You're pushing the industry forward. Thank you so much. And thanks to our listeners for listening.
Thank you, everyone. And come back again soon, Megan.
Yeah.